Imperial Struggle. So, it ain't Twilight Struggle. And it ain't Twilight Imperium either. I'd say it's somewhere in between. No. Okay. So first off, I like Twilight Struggle enough that, and, am convinced that it must be indeed such a great competitive game, that I certainly was willing to give this a shot. I like the topic, the subject matter enough that it was almost a must-buy on that in and of itself. Combine the two, and yeah, that decided me. This was getting pre-ordered. I was going to take a shot. But as I said in the intro, it has more of its roots. So Twilight Struggle had its roots in simplifying the CDG mechanism, right? The card-driven war game mechanism that Mark Herman designed was very much expressed in Twilight Struggle, but it was sort of a let's trim as much from this as we can and make something very simple, something more boiled down. And that boiled down, came to just a few different kinds of actions that you can do, no maneuvering around. We've seen this distilled even further. Games like 13 Days do that. I don't think they succeed. One that may have is Herman's own Fort Sumter. That seemed a little easier. Instead of taking what was a simplified historical game mechanism, or taking an already simpler historical game mechanism, and I have to say, the card-driven game, in its beginnings, were fairly simple. We the People, maybe not so much Paths of Glory, but successors. These games had a fairly abstract view of the combat situation. Now, there's no question before you got to Twilight Struggle, you were seeing games, For the People is one of them, and that we're pushing that to, hey, let's see if we can get a little bit more complexity, a little bit more of the military detail into these games, so that they're not, just little area control type things where you're moving stacks and rolling some combat. And Twilight Struggle took it in the other direction and said, hey, no, let's distill this to a circumstance that we can play on a much simpler plane, and bring it down to what the sort of common public is more willing to accept. And I think that's got a lot to do with what made Twilight Struggle such a popular game. Was it took a mechanism that was very good, is very rich and strong to begin with, and then presented it at an even simpler level than it was previously presented, without getting too simple the way 13 Days does, in my opinion. And there's even worse than 13 Days. There's 1955, which is almost a CDG without, a board. It barely has a board. It basically has a track that you're fighting over. 3 tracks that you're fighting over. But in any case, what the designers managed to find there, through, I'm certain, very careful play testing and consideration, not just something you stumble onto, was a very tightly competitive game that was playable and reachable by most of the public. This one took a different philosophy towards what the design was going to be. It's still rooted largely in a historical sense. But instead of taking a mechanism that was rooted in that historical games tradition, to whatever degree, CDGs are rooted in an attempt to make war games more accessible. And then Twilight Struggle takes that a little further than maybe even We the People did. Instead of doing that, what this took was, let's take the heavy, rich Euro mechanisms, the modern Euro concept, which is a bunch of different mechanisms, a whole big point salad that's too obfuscated to quickly grasp, right? Where there's, compounding effects and everything. So it's not, in Twilight Struggle, it's fairly simple to start. After a play or so, you start seeing how you can, what things you need to do to win, and you immediately start refining your process very quickly. The learning curve is is very shallow on Twilight Struggle, I would say. That's not to say it's not a deep game in the end. I'm saying that early learning curve, you jump pretty far during your first play or whatever. But the modern Euro is designed with the idea of trying to get playability through making the web of connections between different things that you can do more and more complex, more and more obfuscated. So it's harder to see what things do what in the game. And this game follows that principle. Throw a lot of different mechanisms in, mix and match them together. In my 2 plays, if you want to call them 2, because one game ended rather early, but anyway, in my 2 plays, I'm not able to tell you how finely balanced, are there a sufficient number of different strategies and ways to go about this and attack this. There are certainly sufficient number of them to do so, but are they all viable? Are they all equally valid? Is there an inherent bias for one side or the other? The 2 games I played were both won by the French. The first one for an identifiable reason. The second one also perhaps for an identifiable reason, but it's one that I have more trouble breaking out of, which is that the opportunism of certain cards led me perhaps down paths that were best not taken. I should not like this game at all. I should be looking at it and saying it's like my dominant species experience in terms of it involves a great deal of counting. It involves a great deal of trying to figure out what the board state actually is at any given point, in order to tell, what do I want? What are the good things out there? What are the good action tiles to pick? Whatever. I don't like that kind of decision making, where basically if you spend more time counting and thinking about what the board state is, you're in a better position to make good decisions. I much prefer something where you're challenging general principles against each other, and then the luck flows into that. Could you play this that way? Well, sure. You could say something like, I'm going to concentrate on North America or Europe or something like that. Well, you clearly have to take into account in this game what the different permutations of the chaos end up being, and that chaos is driven to a large extent by the event deck. But it's also driven by your opponent's actions. Every action the opponent takes, you might say, well, I could just counter that and try to work against that. That's something that exists in Twilight Struggle too, except for one thing. In both games, there's this concept of one side or the other has an advantage on something. It's not necessarily an advantage that's just inherent. It's an advantage built in by the current situation, by the cards you hold, by the tiles that are available to pick. Until the end of the second game that I played, the one that I played on video, I had never felt like, I can't do something reasonable that'll keep me kind of in the game. Things started looking very, very bad for the British in that game. And however, I do believe that I made certain key mistakes in terms of ignoring some things that I did not realize just how powerful the synergy that the French were building up, really was. Okay. So anyway, one of the things that I was trying to say, though, is that, yes, this is a game I should not like. I don't like the super heavy Euros. I don't like that kind of decision making. I don't like where I don't really understand the board without doing a lot of mechanical effort to count and figure out where I am. That really has to be done in this highly interactive manner again and again and again and again. Basically, on each of my plays, I have to reassess the board, and reassessing the board involves a lot of calculation of some sort or another. Some of it I can do shooting from the hip early on in a particular turn, but as you get late in the turn, you're coming to a scoring opportunity, and you do have to assess the board. Now, in Twilight Struggle, you have a lot more plays in between those scoring situations, in a sense. It's not four. You basically get 4 plays in this game, and then you get to score. And then 4 more plays, and you get to score. In addition to those plays, you have to really figure out what those 4 plays are going to be in advance by looking at the tile selection, looking at the current board state, and figure out where you're going to make your pattern over this next little period of turn. So there's a lot of heavy thinking, breaking up between the turns, and then even in the turns, you're finding each card play requires a great deal of reassessment of the board situation, and again, looking to see how you can optimize on it. It's just not my kind of game. On the other hand, I found myself having a fair amount of fun with it, at least explaining it on video, my thought processes. So it wasn't getting, so here's the thing, that board assessment usually, except for when I had my COVID moment, which I'm still in the midst of, it seems, was not too onerous, usually, especially in the early game. But, it's not like the game gets tremendously more complex with each play. There's just more stuff on the board, so you have to count more of that stuff because India is getting filled out, and the different regions are getting more filled out as the game continues. So there's a certain level of, yes, it does get more complex, but it's not some kind of exponential growth curve. It's still at about the level, it's maybe twice as hard, but that shouldn't be a devastating kind of problem in general. And I think other than my poor brain giving out on me today, which it does regularly now, I think that was not a complete, it wasn't so mental mechanically onerous that it totally detracted from any enjoyment of the game at all. That there was an enjoyment there. There was a pleasure in making some of these decisions, some of the connections. Even if I made them wrong, I would hate it playing opposed, but that's different. But yeah, somehow I found some enjoyment to it. I'm not sure what to mark that up to. Are the systems better than the ones in Dominant Species? Is the counting a little bit more intuitive that I can draw in? Because I've been staying away from these kind of games. Is the counting become more intuitive where I just have to focus on one little thing at a time and just look at it and say, yeah, this is the area I want to go for. This is fine. Because it is kind of an area majority type thing in a lot of ways. I don't know. One thing I can say about it is, for the most part, the history is more believable. But what's not is sort of the driving focus for the player. You're not... So, different areas of the world are just sort of randomly assigned different values at different periods. Yeah, I don't know what that means, And then certain global markets are randomly brought to the fore, although their valuation is based on the turn. So there's a little, let's see if we can get this, a global demand chart, which is actually divided by period, which means certain raw materials, certain of these resources that you are competing on, the same way you're competing on parts of the globe, become more or less valuable over time. So you can kind of plan for which ones are important at any given point. But the truth of the matter is, it's completely random which 3 are selected as the actually valuable as opposed to the ones that have a greater chance of being more valuable at any given point. So the fact that there is this historical bent in there is tempered completely, and from a game point of view, I understand that, it allows you to throw in some of that chaos so that people can't so they're not sitting down playing the same game each time. But what it means is that some resource, like fish, may never be important at all in a game. In my first game, it never came up. What does that mean? I mean, fisheries were incredibly important to the building of the English fleet, among other things. Connections like that are kind of missing, or at best are contained in something like one of these little connections that, hey, if you have this, you get this, and you get some ability to do something. So those correspond to certain tiles that give you sort of a free action. So the normal flow of the game for an action is you pick you draft one of a set of action tiles that are available to both players, and they take turns drafting those. And those tiles give you certain capabilities. Basically, there's 3 types of capabilities in the game, and each tile is going to give you 2 of those 3. One of them in a stronger flavor than the other. The weaker flavor is actually pretty weak in some cases. And so essentially each of your action phases, you're going to be picking one tile that gives you 2 types of thing that you're going to do. And those things are going to be geographically located. In the case of the major action, limited to a map region, a continent, whatever you want to call it. In the case of a minor action, pretty much limited to 1 space in the game. Now, there's a way to expand your actions, which is through the event cards, to some extent through the ministries. But for the primary thing is through the event cards, which can give you an additional major action in some cases, in many cases. The event cards are triggered also by the tiles. So again, during that selection thing, you don't get to play the events that are in your hand unless you pick the tiles that are less valuable for other things to do that. But these special action tiles, if you want to call them that, I don't remember what they're actually called, give you sometimes things that you can just do outside your normal actions. And you can just trigger them off once, and they allow you to do something kind of cool once per turn. They allow you to do something kind of cool on the board or elsewhere, in some cases like reducing your debt. I don't think there's anything that really applies to that related to the fisheries, is there? Yeah, so I'm looking at the fisheries, and there's nothing here that allows you to build more ships or anything like that, and there really should be one. That would be suiting with the game. Another thing that's kind of missing that I found in the history that really bothered me was there wasn't really a link between the complete victory on the continent and the revolution that occurred. And at least for the British colonies, what we kind of know is that the removal of the French as a threat made them more bold in terms of withdrawing their desire and need for British protection and their willingness to pay for British protection, even protection in the past that helped them. So that, they were unhappy with being taxed. It's kind of like American citizens. Hey, we got done with World War II. Screw the war debt. Wyoming doesn't want to pay taxes. I mean, what? Why? Yeah, that's very much rooted though in the American experience, right? Okay. So there are a few places where I look at the history and say, there's not much there. But you wouldn't expect the players, though, to be planning on that. So, like, Britain wanted to win the French and Indian War portion of the 7 Years' War, and they wanted to capture that territory. But the unintended consequences of that were the dissolution. Now, I don't find anything in the game that really cleanly indicates that, the American Revolution is more likely to be lost by the British, or more likely to happen. It's going to happen no matter what, but it's more likely to be lost if they get rid of the French. If you leave the French up there, they're more likely to have power to help create problems within the colonies. And so you kind of have the opposite of the actual historical bent, but on the other hand, in terms of driving the players' decisions, the British were not considering, well, if we get rid of the French, our colonies are going to revolt. So that kind of shouldn't enter into the decision-making. It's a problem that occurs in any game of this type. If you're going to try to reflect the actual causes of something, well, how much do you want to give the players that input? And I can kind of respect either decision there. The way I kind of like it is to obfuscate the impact by hiding it in events that the players can't see and don't know. But the problem with that, of course, is this is a game that's designed, like the CDGs are, etc., to be a highly competitive, repeated play type game. And if you're going to do that, well, the players are going to learn the events. It's not a play once and done, like you could maybe argue with the Europa Universalis event book. Even with that, though, I'm still surprised by things I find in it. Okay. Oh, what else can I say? So, yeah, the history, the play is this too heavy for me to keep in my mind Euro and completely and intuitively understand and try to play without having to do a lot of mechanical counting. On the other hand, it's right at the edge of what I can do, which is to say that I can count it all up. I can AP the hell out well. It's not really analysis paralysis if I'm able to just do the counting. I can take the time and waste everybody at my opponent's time, which is okay in a two-player game, I guess, but like I said, a lot of these games, most of these heavy Euros are multiple players, and I'm sitting there saying, I know that I can calculate this, maybe not entirely, but almost entirely out and understand it. But I think the goal to them is play it enough times, and then, you sort of subconsciously learn how to assess the board better. And what the pitfalls are. Well, I don't play anything too many times, so I'm going to try to break something like this and understand it. I'm not sure what my battery is like on here. Let's take a peek. Yeah, we're still going just peachy. One of the problems is I don't have a whole hell of a lot to say here. Isn't that obvious? All right, let's go to the components, and then we'll get move onward. GMT went all out on this, as can be expected in a lot of ways. Nice hard board, stiff cards, not too big a deal because they're small decks. You do very little shuffling in the game, and get the sort of premium super stiff cards that don't shuffle well, but I didn't find too much trouble with them. Again, the small decks. If they were big decks, it would be a real pain. They'd be flying all over the place on me. Nice thick counters. Didn't need a lot of trimming on them. Somebody's complaining about the Union Jack. I'm not sure I know enough to really realize that. They chose to use the fleur-de-lis rather than the white background of the French flag. Whatever. So some of the counters are misleading in their information. In fact, give information that is in disagreement with. You got 2 player aids, they have the sequence of play and some information here. That information here is the advantage tile guide. Some of the counters say one thing there and one thing on here. For those that they do, it's always this that is correct. But there's kind of a difficulty in doing a lookup from one to the other, which is a little painful. You might have to do that anyway, but anyway, there's a couple of counters that have something misleading on them, which you should probably, which maybe you want to change. Maybe there's some possibility that GMT would, produce a patch to the game or something. I don't know. The only historical link to the wars in terms of personalities or whatever is you have specific tokens linked to each war, but the set of tokens for each war is exactly the same for every war in terms of its actual game effects. So all you have is different names on them. In a way, maybe that's a waste of tokens, but it adds some flavor and history to it, and it allowed them to fill up several pages of the playbook with historical information on who these people are. It doesn't contain any information that further explains the counters. These counters are fairly easy to understand. You're looking at them again and again. You get very used to the iconography on the action tiles. It's a little more difficult on the military tiles. I find myself, because the military turns are really just little scoring turns that happen in between the regular turns. The regular turns have their scoring too. But the military turns are sort of the way the turn sequence goes. And I had thought this would be so much more exciting, kind of like Grand Sequel is. I don't know if I'm going to find it. Here we go. So what you have is peace turns with interspersed wars in between them. And the way Grand Sequel handles that is it's all kind of open, but a war breaks out in the midst of peace, and basically the peace turns last a variable amount of time. You roll a die to see how long or whatever, and then there's the opportunity for a war to break out in between, where you actually start maneuvering military things on the board and do military stuff, and you're not allowed to really do it in between. You're allowed to prepare for the military stuff, though. With this, what you're doing is, in the peace turns, you're aiming to get victory points in the different areas on the board and the different commodities on the board, and you have 3 different tools to do that. Things that you do that affect the war are involved in this. The only thing that really kind of doesn't affect the war directly is your commerce phase. Having a good economy, at least a mercantile economy, doesn't affect what your war situation is really going to be. When you get to the war, you're looking across a different view of the same map in a sense. So like military establishments, bases, fleets, etc., count towards your geographical victory points in peace terms. Commodities count in peace terms too. They're not going to count in the war. But the forts, the squadrons, and then one more thing, diplomatic power in certain regions, alliances. Now those alliances are all on Europe if they're going to affect any wars, because, I don't know, there's some effect with the alliances like in the colonies. So if you have an alliance with various Indian nations, or Native American nations, two different things, you get the capability to put conflict markers on the board, and those can affect the war. But it's a more complex process to get an effect in the war from those. And those also affect the economic principles as well. So basically, the war is another view of the same situation, but one that focuses more on certain military things. And then there are some things in the war that are not included in the normal board scoring at all, which is the actual combat chits that you get. And those are these suckers. They have a bonus on them. You're allowed to have basically one basic war chit, which you get for free in each theater of a war, and up to 2 bonus chits, which you have to buy. And you can swap your basic one out as well in some, under certain action chits. So you do your preparation for the war. You set up the war during the peace term, and the actions that you take to set up the war may be costing you something. I mean, they almost all cost you something, but some of them help to some extent in the peace term scoring. But then you come to the special war term scoring, and the war term scoring is a little different. It's not just victory points on it. So the peacetime scoring, you get victory points, and maybe you get treaty points for winning a region. You may also get debt in the commodities or debt reduction. But here, when you hit the war scoring, it's really by a margin of victory value, and it has certain impacts. And those can be a number of different things. Some can be flat victory points, some can be treaty points, which actually go to the loser rather than the winner in general. But some of them are conquest points, which allow you to take territories, something you can't take in square areas normally in the game. You could also spend them on non-territories. On forts, it's a very cheap way to get forts, and on markets, it's not a great deal on markets, in my opinion. Markets are sort of the cheapest thing to get in the game through the economic phase. There are also a few wars that have very special cases where, it impacts something that's outside of that, creates an event. The Atlantic dominance creates a bonus in a future war, in another theater in the war, which is kind of interesting. A very valuable theater in the war, which is the French and Indian War. All right. Okay. So that kind of gives you a feel for the way the sequence interleaves. And what's not really exciting about it to me is you don't really do anything in the war. The war just reveals how well you prepared for the war. I can understand that it's not a war game at all, but I also feel like those wars are such important things. I'd like to be maneuvering and doing stuff in them because I'm a war gamer, right? Okay. So that was something that was a little disappointing when I first saw it. When I first saw the discussion about the game, as I started saying, "Hey, it's coming close to being done," I was already sold on it and everything. I was a little disappointed. I was excited to see that interleaving of peace and war turns. The truth of the matter is the war turns are really nothing but an automated scoring system that comes in relation to the wars. There may be some other impacts to it, but it's not something where you're making any decisions when you're actually in the war turn. It's just an additional scoring impacts. Let me check the time. I can't remember. Just to get a feel. All right. I might be able to get this all in on one battery. Let me peek through this to see if I've got anything that I really want to say about it. Have I talked about it? Yeah, I haven't talked about all the components. So the cards, some of the cards have some minor errors on them that have to be written. The rule book, fucking glossy rule book again, which means pencil did not work on it. I had a hope that I could use pencils on all glossy rule books because I had one recently, Stellar Horizons from Compass, where the pencil worked on, where a number 2 pencil worked on it. My mechanical pencils wouldn't. But yeah, I had to break down and use a Sharpie on this to write, which means indelible changes, poorly written, whatever. There's a fair amount of errata on this game. Some of it includes on the map, some of it on counters, some of it on cards. Most of it is clarifications in the roll. But yeah, there are some places. Oh, some of it on the player aids. Yeah. It feels like it got rolled out the door too quickly. Now, as far as I can tell, not much of that has to do with the gameplay itself. It's not like there's any glaring, oh my god, I can just control the game if I've got this. The things that allowed me to push, or that allowed me to end the game early with a French victory, 3 turns in, well, what? 3 turns in? Yeah, 3 turns in, halfway through the game, probably are things that their opponent, the British, could have prevented had they been a little more careful. I'm not absolutely certain, though. There seemed to be a nice synergy between some of the cards the French had that may have been fairly unstoppable. Not entirely so, but the thing is, when you're doing something that has a nice synergy, you're getting a bonus in that direction. And your opponent, to try to stop that synergy, is going to be paying a higher price to do so. Because the reason you're going in that direction, usually, is because you've got cards that give you added bonuses. And if they're using their cards that give added bonuses, but that allow you to get away with something unreasonable, there's a problem. And again, both games I saw, the French won. But the first one I think I made a fatal error with the British, although it lasted a lot longer, in terms of not taking enough bonus activation chips, because those are free extra actions, or they're extra actions to some extent, or reductions to things that you can do. So they can be very, very powerful because you have such a limited number of actions. Well, the second game, I don't know. I just don't know. I'm really worried because, yes, the event cards definitely gave the French an advantage towards choosing the goals that they did. But if they had chosen those goals anyway, I'm not so sure that the British would have necessarily been able to stomp on those goals. Certainly, the correspondence of the bonuses from the events working to create that particular synergy, I think, was a problem no matter what for the British. So the luck of the draw can, if that's true, win you the game. And there's other factors in here that can cause equal luck related type things, which is like, if you're established strong on one continent and somebody else is established strong on another, well, the victory point markers can just keep coming up on your continent. So you can't let somebody do that. Or maybe you just say, yeah, I'll let them do that because I'm going to get strong in this other one. And, it's like flipping a coin to see who wins in that case, which may have been part of what happened. Is that although I felt like the British were not that strong in any continent except the French managed to get this huge, they were exceptionally weak in one, and it was the most valuable of the continents because Europe kept coming up as the best. You definitely have a capacity to screw with the enemy fairly heavily. The enemy does something, you can often counteract what he does, but not always, because it's limited by the tiles and the event cards that the player has available to use. There's an interesting thing with these ministry cards, which are a way to get that kind of synergy that I was talking about previously with your event cards, and maybe with other situations on the board. But they have their own abilities as well. And some of those abilities are quite strong. And it may be that the event cards that have the more valuable synergy capabilities are a little weaker overall. And if you end up getting the combination of a strong thing with a good synergy on a decent event, it's going to be a major bonus in the game. And again, a luck-based thing that may be hard for the opponent to counteract in the same way that they would otherwise. You have a little bit of control over your deck because of the ministry cards. So again, you get a certain number of event cards. You may not be able to play all your event cards because the ones you can play are dependent on the tiles that are available and on you picking them as well. So you try to reach this sort of correspondence between the ministry cards that you're picking, the event cards that you're dealt, and the tiles that are available. And of course the board situation as well. That applies too. Now, if you have leftover event cards, you have to discard down to 3. So you have a capability to kind of, you're not always drawing a new fresh hand of event cards to use. You get 3 new ones each peace turn, but you can cull them based on your ministry cards. One interesting thing is each period, you only kind of get to pick your ministry cards once, unless you choose to forego using them in the first turn of the period, or using one of them, in which case you can swap it out. There's pretty much a cost to not using it though. In the game that I played, the French chose not to use one in order to swap it out, and it cost them a victory point. A victory point's a big deal in the game. There's only 30 total, you know. I'm just trying to see if there's anything we want to try to get to. I know I'm not doing this justice. I've seen other people who, who are more excited about the game, but it's not like there's anything really terribly wrong that's just standing out and saying, this is horrible because of this. It definitely is not. It's just heavier than I want this type of game to be. That's where I'm sitting with it. Is I don't want to do all this all this mechanical mental stuff. Anyway, you have some kind of broader choices. Where am I going to fight? Where am I going to push for the advantages? Am I more interested in the war than in the peace turn? Because maybe the bonuses are better for the war. You got to make those kind of decisions fairly regularly. And then, of course, again, your enemy can foil whatever strategy that you're taking because you're putting it out there on the board, and they have points that they can counteract with it. That's the same as Twilight Struggle, where your points may be more advantageous to you because of some events or because of some circumstances that are in play. And it's similar to that. The concept of debt. Okay, so there's 2 ways you can get kind of wild points in the game. You can get bonus points off cards and off of the action shit. I don't know what the hell they're called. Advantage tiles. I keep calling both the action shits. They're the advantage tiles, which you get from locations on the board that give you something that you can use once per turn, basically. But you also have wild card points that you can use. And some of them come from treaty points, and those are just free and they're great. Others come from debt.
you accumulate debt to get points to do some of your major and minor actions, to improve the amount of points you have for them. Debt comes with a problem, which is that there are certain events that will screw with you if you have more debt than your opponent. If your debt goes too high, you start losing victory points instead of debt. And you can't voluntarily do this. But it gives you the flexibility so that you're not limited to the points that are on the tiles. One of the things, though, is the difference between major and minor actions on the tiles. The major actions are very flexible, and you can throw a bunch of debt or treaty points in to allow you to do all kind of stuff all over the world, as long as you have the points to do it. The minor actions are limited to one space, and in a lot of cases, it's hard to find the one space that has, that you want to do something in that has just that right amount of points. Quite often, the one space that your choices on these are often between, I can do something that's kind of economical, but it means I'm only paying 1 and I have 2 points and I can't split them up because it's a minor action. Or you have to, in order to do something you really want to do, you're going to have to throw in one of your bonus points to make it work. Quite often, because those minor actions are always 2 points, well, if it's a 3-point action, it's going to cost you more. If it's a 1-point action, you're throwing a point away and you feel like you're wasting something. So you're always kind of racked with this, oh shit, I don't want to do this. I want to optimize. I want to get, make my points do the most they can. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think this is going to be, the kind of thing that Twilight Struggle was. It's hard for me to tell because the Euro market, let me pause. The Euro market nowadays is more about heavier Euros that are similar to this. But on the other hand, I think the market may be shrinking. I don't know enough about the industry to tell you that. It feels to me sort of that gaming was maybe a bigger deal with the lighter games. And if you still look at people who are going in and playing in the stores, or there's a lot of more casual gamers. And the heavier Euro market, I think, is appealing to the people who, I figured that out, great, I know how to play Twilight Struggle well, no, but I know how to play, I don't know, like a Pandemic or something like that. I got it more or less figured out. Doesn't mean I'll win every time, but, I know how to optimize over that space. Give me something more complicated now. Give me something better. Give me something that's gonna challenge me for 3 or 4 plays, and then I'll put that one away and I'll go to the next one. That's the challenge too. And by making it a 2-player competition, that shouldn't be as hard. But anyway, there's a segment of the population that's very much into those very heavy Euros, where there's a reliance on obfuscating sort of what you're trying to do in the game, make you play it out a few times so that you have this impression, at least, when you write your review, when you rate it the first time or whatever, when it's actually still being sold, that it's like, oh yeah, this is a really deep game because I didn't figure out what is supposed to be done right away. Well, that's not the kind of depth I'm really excited about. I don't know if I'm really excited about depth anyway. I stopped playing Go, but I'm more pleased with the idea that I kind of understand what I should be doing, and effecting that is harder. Now, where's the line on that? I mean, I'm supposed to collect victory points. No, that's obviously too much. But, I mean, this game comes up with a series of places where you're just getting these points and you're accumulating them as a point salad when it comes down to it. And when you start doing that, when you start mixing and matching different, play mechanisms, the tile selection, the placement, the area, the majority area control type thing. When you start mixing all kind of different mechanisms together, you get away from what I saw as sort of the guiding principle of the early Euros, which was, hey, here's a pretty simple game. We've thrown a theme on it. It doesn't really mean much. It could be an abstract as far as I can tell, and there's probably some luck in it. Not a lot of player competition, not a lot of direct conflict between the players, but you're trying to accumulate something, and you see what happens, and it's really not that big a deal. And I think a lot of the gamers out there who aren't serious, who aren't really into gaming as their major thing, but they use it as more of a social aspect, are still playing those. And would those players have been available for a Twilight Struggle? That's kind of the problem, because Twilight Struggle is kind of longer, it is kind of heavier. So maybe the people who were really into Twilight Struggle have largely, at least among the Euro crowd, have largely migrated here towards this. The problem that I have has the wargaming crowd that was also getting pulled into Twilight Struggle, because it did use a wargaming mechanism. It did show a conflict that is interesting to a lot of wargamers. Will they be attracted to this as much? And I think that's going to be an iffier thing. I think this is going to be appealing to wargamers who are into heavy Euros too, obviously. I mean, that's a given. If you're into the heavy Euros, I think this is a game that you are going to enjoy if you're willing to play a two-player, purely competitive heavy Euro, where you're just trying to whack the other person. If you're into Twilight Struggle as a Euro, but if you're coming from a wargaming position where something like Twilight Struggle was, it's okay, I'm willing to do this because it's kind of light, and I feel like this way I can play with my friends who aren't really into a war game. I can do it when I'm when I'm willing to lean back and relax a little bit more. I think that's okay. But this comes closer maybe to kind of the coin games, but again, I don't really feel like I'm dedicating persistent force into something for a long-term position like coin has. And coin also has the advantage of being multiplayer, the advantage and the curse. So the multiplayer curse advantage of coin is that you're by competing with different people, you're constantly trying to shoot down the leader, right? And that's kind of what makes the game system work. And I gotta say, the same thing is true with Here I Stand. And I've got a real question why I love Here I Stand, and the coin systems I feel are a little off from that because they're both designs where you're optimizing, where you're trying to optimize your victory points in order to get ahead of all the other players enough that you can get a win. I think it actually has more to do with how they actually play out, and the fact that the coin games, almost invariably, somebody is able to, the other players are able to knock you back. But Here I Stand, sometimes you're not. You're able to pull off a victory without an early victory. But with this, you certainly can pull off an early victory. I showed that. This goes further than the coin games. The coin games have one sort of simple mechanism, and the rest is expressed on your player aid card, the specifics to it. The difficulty and the weirdness in that become, and some of the coins are starting to go into the too heavy zone too. I mean, Pendragon feels like it's pushing the limits of coin. So yeah, I mean, if you're into the idea of that and of calculating over that, especially if you were into two-player bot-assisted coin, I think this would probably appeal to you. Where you're trying to not only leverage your player capability against the enemy player's interests, but also trying to manipulate things so that the bots play as they like. If you can hold that all in your head and work it, you can handle this, I'm sure. But yeah, this just felt like I'm trying to keep track of too many different vectors that points are coming from in a way that I just don't like, Anyway, I've babbled on and on without really getting to the heart of anything. And yeah, I realize that I'm talking about a kind of game that is not in my sweet spot. It really isn't. And that's kind of difficult because I can't talk about the narrative. The narrative is hidden behind the actions. That's the problem. I'm interested in games where I can sit back and watch what's going. And the more interactive a game is, the more pulsing between one player and the next, the ping pong type quality that this has, and the CDGs have it too, and coin has it too, the harder it is to see the narrative build out. And it's especially hard when there aren't, sort of clear boundaries. When I'm just moving markets back and forth, and some of the simpler coins too, some of the simpler CDGs had this too. I mean, We the People. I'm busy trying to politic to shift a marker and flip a marker or something. I'm so tied up in that I'm not watching the events unfold in reality. And this is the same thing. I'm not seeing the events come out in reality. What I'm doing is I'm concentrating on optimizing what I can do to gain points constantly. And coin is the same way. And when I'm doing that, the problem with it is not only am I not getting the narrative, but I don't have the narrative to rely on to drive my strategy. So I don't have a strategy. All I have is this, I might have a strategy the way that, for the game, in game terms, yeah, I think it would be useful to try to win the 7 Years' War. And see if I can win the game by that point, just because I think I have certain edges that I can advantage and everything. But that's not what I'm talking about. That's optimizing the game again. That's not along the lines of, what would it be like if I concentrate in North America? Well, that's meaningless in this because you don't know what resources are going to score. You don't know what continents are going to be important. It's all about scoring the points. So there's, nothing that you can look at and say, yeah, fish are an important resource all throughout the game, no matter what. Because of this, there's certain synergies that I can build up with fish. I want to go for fish. No, you want to go for fish if fish are important. And if North America is important, you don't care about them if they're not. And, the randomization of that makes it simply an optimization in an opportunistic sort of way. All right. Enough of shooting my voice off here.